Kia ora koutou. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we start, I'm just going to open us with a karakia. Kia inui tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. Kia hi ake ana te utukura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauriora. Ina reo, ina mana, rauranga tira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ka tū te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora koutou, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight on this really important kaupapa discussing the draft freshwater plan change for the Northland Regional Council. We really appreciate the time that people have taken to join us tonight. My name is November Wai. I'm the Group Manager for Environmental Services, and I will be your MC for the evening. We've got a series of speakers tonight, and I'm just going to run through the agenda to enable everyone to have a clear picture about what you're all getting yourselves into this evening. So we have, we're going to start off with some opening remarks from Councillor Jack Craw, our Northland Regional Council Deputy Chair. Then we'll be running through the draft freshwater plan change overview. So basically, how we arrived at where we did today, and that's going to be completed by one of our staff members, our strategic policy specialist, Justin Murfitt. The next kōrero will be from one of our Tāngata Whenau Water Advisory Group members, Amira Norris, and she will be giving an overview of the input that the Tāngata Whenau Water Advisory Group has provided through this process. And the last component will be an overview of the provisions themselves by another staff member, Leon Kiefer, our policy specialist. And then towards the end, we will have a Q&A session. And I'll just, in terms of housekeeping, there is a Q&A session at the bottom of your screen. Through that, you can ask questions. And towards the end of the presentations this evening, we will be providing responses from our panel. And on our panel tonight, we've got the three individuals that I mentioned who will be presenting. On top of that, we've got three of our councillors joining us, including Jack Craw, Marty Robinson, and Councillor John Blackwell. And so they will also be available to respond to questions that come up. We really appreciate receiving feedback over this process. This is a really important kaupapa, and so I'd encourage anyone who has a query and would like to a response from one of the panelists, please put it in the Q&A session. Okay, so first off, we're going to have an opening from Councillor Jack Craw.
Kia ora, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Northland Regional Council's online hui to talk about how we manage our fresh water in Te Tautokerau. Actually, I'm filling in for our chair tonight. Fresh water is precious and essential to all of us and for our unique ecosystems and our biodiversity, the health of our communities, sustainable livelihoods and resilience to the effects of climate change. Central government has recognised the importance of fresh water and directed regional and unitary authorities across Aotearoa to significantly improve freshwater health. We know from our monitoring and what our communities have told us that most of the waterways in our region are in a very poor state, with E. coli and sedimentation being two of the biggest problems for the health of freshwater in our region. Fixing these problems will take a lot of time. Some of the problems we face with our freshwater quality, such as sedimentation, will take decades to improve, and we're running out of time. The impacts of climate change, such as flooding and drought, are already increasing pressure on our waterways and our communities. Healthy fresh water can help to mitigate these impacts, flooding and climate change. Wetlands slow and absorb water during floods, and planting in catchment areas and around waterways slows the rise of floodwaters and reduces erosion, filter sediment. Some of the things we could do will carry a cost for landowners, and we know that many of them are already facing tough times. Believe me, we know this. We need to make decisions that will work for our communities as well as our waterways. That's why it's so important that we get input from our communities, especially those who are likely to be most directly affected. Farmers and landowners, Tāngata whenua, and our rangatahi, the future generations who will be living with the consequences of the decisions we make. The proposed implementation timeframes are pretty long, so no matter what happens, there will be no sudden shocks for anybody. With input from Tāngata whenua and the primary sector, Council has done a lot of thinking about how we manage freshwater and what we need to do differently and what the most appropriate timeframes might be for putting changes in place. Tonight, you'll hear from our presenters about the work that we've done, the draft changes we'd like your feedback on, and how we arrived at the draft changes we're putting forward. But most importantly, tonight is an opportunity for Council to hear from you. We've set aside quite a bit of time for your questions after the presentations, so please feel free to send us any questions you have in the chat. I can't stress that more strongly. Please take advantage. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our MC Ruben and all our presenters and all of you for joining tonight. Your presence and your input are vital in helping us to shape this plan. Thank you.
Kia ora, Jack. Thank you for that. And we'll lead straight into our first presentation by Justin.
Kia ora, everyone. I'm going to spend about 10 or so minutes just providing a bit of an overview around the background to the draft freshwater plan change. I'll be covering what's in it, what is it and what's in it, why Council has embarked on this process, and I'll give a quick overview of some of the key challenges that we're facing with freshwater in Northland. So quickly, the background, what is it? Well, it's essentially Council's initial thinking on ways we can improve freshwater in Northland. It's a combination of changes to rules and some of the actions and changes to activities that Council undertakes around freshwater. The scope of the plan change is very much limited to freshwater only. We can't deal with something, say a discharge to air rule or something like that. It is pretty much focused on freshwater. It is a draft, so it has no legal effect. It's not something that's required by law for Council to do. It's something Council was very keen on, having an opportunity to test our thinking with communities, Tāngata whenua, stakeholders and the like, before we get into a formal process, a proposed regional plan change around freshwater, which we're hoping to embark on late next year. We understand, as Deputy Chair mentioned, that the impacts are potentially quite significant for landowners. So we really need the feedback to make sure we get the package right before we get into the formal stage. So this is the opportunity, as we've said, till early March to hear from you in the informal sense and revise as we need to when we get to the proposed stage, which is this formal submissions, hearings process and the like. So the package itself, it's a combination of things. Key things are the draft plan change text. Now that's basically a marked up version of the freshwater provisions in our regional policy statement, regional plan. If you see that document, it's available online. It has strike through and underlined to indicate the changes. It's in combination with a draft action plan, which is sort of a summary of the options, that non-regulatory options, sort of actions that Council could undertake on the ground to help support, achieve goals for freshwater. And we'll get into a bit more detail on those in a minute. The summary document, it's basically a high-level overview of what the key changes are and how to give you feedback. One of the key documents in this package is have your say on stock exclusion. And that's the focus of that is options around managing stock access to waterways and some of our more sensitive, highly erodible landscapes. Council has not identified or confirmed rules for stock access at this point. Council understands the potential implications for landowners. The costs are significant. So wanted to get some feedback on these options that we've put together in this document. And some of those are around the setback distances from waterways, a range of options, 3, 5, 10 metres, and potentially rules around access to some of our highly erodible land. That's a key one. And would really encourage you to sort of dive into that in some detail. It's supported by some cost estimates around these options. Those cost estimates look at the different scenarios for setbacks, for example, say 3, 5 metres, what's the difference, 10 metres, what's the difference in cost? It includes the cost of fencing, the opportunity cost of not being able to graze that land, for example, the cost of reticulating water and the like. So we'd be very interested in your thoughts on whether we've got that right. So yeah, strongly encourage people to look at that one. The package also includes a discussion document around a targeted allocation policy. We've been, as mentioned earlier, we've been very lucky in the fact that we've had advice from a Tāngata Whenua Water Advisory Group. This is one of their recommendations, and among a suite of them, but this is a one around an option for essentially setting aside a fraction of water available for allocation for particular purposes, environmental enhancement, supporting water for marae, papakainga, and development of Māori land. It's not a complete no access by other people for other purposes, but it is novel, and council wanted to get some feedback on that before progressing any further with the detail. Other things in the package include sort of a short, very brief summary of the key changes. An important feature here is the GIS map viewer. That shows some of the key maps around freshwater management that council uses. One new layer in there that'll be of a lot of interest to landowners is maps of highly erodible land. They are draft maps, and we're testing the concept. 2 layers of highly erodible land based on slope. Slopes between 25 and 35 degrees, and another layer 35 degrees and over. We know sediment and erosion is a massive issue in Northland. We think this draft plan change gives us an opportunity to sort of improve how we identify erosion risk. It is quite a change to what we've currently got in our regional plan, but we think it's an improvement because slope is a key driver of erosion risk and sediment loss to water in Northland. And we've sort of seen the evidence of that through the likes of the Cyclone Gabriel and other big weather events in Northland. There's also a sort of a background document that's sort of summary of the supporting information that council, some of the information council considered as it was going through this process. So that's sort of what's in it. So why are we doing it? Well, there's several reasons. As Deputy Chair Craw mentioned, we've heard repeatedly over the years from communities, Tāngata Whenua, about concerns with the state of freshwater in our region and the impact on the ability to swim, collect seafood, mahinga kai from rivers, recreational values and the like, and particularly the ecosystem health of waterways. But another key driver is government direction, and that direction comes through a thing called the National Policy Statement for Freshwater, applies to all regional councils in New Zealand. It's basically a direction on what to manage and the process to go through to improve freshwater over time in each region. It's got some key things in it that council must give effect to. One of those is Te Mana o Te Wai and the hierarchy that it applies. It's basically saying you have to put council, when you make decisions around freshwater, you have to put the well-being, the health of the ecosystems and water bodies first. That's your number one priority. Second is the needs of people, say, for example, drinking water and their well-being. Thirdly, pretty much everything else. So economic and social well-being comes third on the list. So that's got to be top of mind for council when it's making decisions around freshwater. One of the other key things in the NPS freshwater, it's got a list of attributes we must manage, and it's also got some national bottom lines, essentially water standards for fresh water that must be met over time. Those are quite challenging. They're set nationally, and issues across New Zealand vary, but we know we've got areas, attributes where we're well below bottom lines that the NPS sets out, and we have to set targets to improve our state of water to meet those bottom lines. Just quickly, the process it sets out is set a vision, a long-term vision for water. It should be achievable, but aspirational. Then we go through the process of identifying the values for fresh water for our region. What do we care about? And then what are the outcomes for those values that we're after? What do we want to achieve in terms of each of those values? The NPS says we've got to manage some compulsory values. Ecosystem health's a key one. Human contact's another, i.e. the risk of contact with fresh water. And mahinga kai and threatened species. There are other values that we also must consider, and we've got some advice from our Tāngata Whenau Water Advisory Group on some additional values for water by Māori. So we've been through sort of some of that process. The other thing we've got to do is identify what we need to measure and manage, i.e. what attributes do we need to measure and manage to protect those values and achieve the outcomes we're after. We then have to go through and say, where do we sit in terms of those attributes? What state are those attributes in? And the NPS sets out a sort of grading system where you can see sort of from poor to very poor, right up to excellent. And we're failing some of those. And where improvement is needed, either to meet national bottom lines or community aspirations for fresh water, we have to set targets to achieve those aspirations over time. So it's quite a complex process we need to go through, and we need to take our communities, Tāngata Whenua stakeholders with us, and we need to develop rules and limits to achieve those outcomes. And also council's got to put out an action plan, i.e. what else can we do that will support those outcomes being achieved. So it is quite a complex animal to deal with. And there's a lot of technical background, which we won't go into, and you're probably not interested anyway. But that's just sort of an overview of the process that we're dealing with. And it will take us time. We've got to set the framework to achieve the outcomes, but the outcomes on the ground will take quite a bit of time to achieve. Some of these are quite intractable problems we've got, and we'll get into that shortly. So what are our big issues? Well, these are the three key things that Northland's grappling with. Erosion and sediment. That's a widespread issue across much of Northland. It's an issue in freshwater, impacts on our freshwater species, their ability to feed and breed and the like. But it's particularly obvious when you look at the state of our estuaries and harbours. Many of them are suffering from sediment accumulation, and that affects, the shellfish, all that marine life, and our ability to recreate and play in freshwater and salt water. And as you all will be aware, our harbours and estuaries are highly valued in Northland. The other big one we've got is E. coli contamination. It's essentially a measure of fecal contamination in water bodies. We have quite a major issue with E. coli. It is widespread across the region in terms of its impact, and it again affects our ability to recreate in water, gather food from water, and many of the sort of activities that we take, drinking water quality, and the like. So it's a pretty big one. The other one is our sort of ecological health of water bodies themselves and the things that live in it. So we know we've got quite seriously impacted waterways, the loss of riparian vegetation, the water quality itself, the water temperature, given the lack of riparian vegetation in some areas. We've got, water temperatures being very high, and lack of shading, low dissolved oxygen, all of that impacting on the habitat quality. So yes, we have big challenges, and they're not easily resolved. Just quickly setting the scene around sediment. As I said, widespread issue across the region. We monitor several attributes for sediment. Visual clarity of water is one of them. Our monitoring data for that indicates probably a better picture than the reality. On the left-hand slide, that map of Northland, you can see some blue dots. Those indicate our monitoring data at our river network sites. The sort of blue lines are modelled. One of the issues there is we don't monitor during high flows when much of the sediment's coming down. So it's just kind of a skewed picture. It's better than probably what's the reality on the ground. Another indicator of our sediment problem and our erosion problem is the map on the right there. That's dissolved reactive phosphorus. It's an indicator. Well, phosphorus is quite common in our geology. It's elevated naturally, but when we get erosion, it travels with the sediment. And you can see there, we've got quite high levels of what they call DRP, or dissolved reactive phosphorus. In our monitoring sites, the red dots are indicated in poor state in terms of this attribute. And we've done some modelling as well that suggests that's fairly widespread across the region as well. So that's a good proxy as an indicator of our sediment problem. The sources of sediment in our waterways, largely land disturbance, things like earthworks and vegetation clearance, cultivation of land and the like, activities on highly erodible land, including potentially stock access to it, exacerbating erosion, and stream bank erosion is another quite strong feature in Northland. When we get high velocity water coming down, big rainfall events, and we don't have vegetated margins, those riverbanks are unstable and erode and end up further downstream in estuaries and harbours and other freshwater bodies as well. So yeah, quite a large intractable problem, one that's not easy to fix. It takes a long time to get stabilised these erodible sites, stream bank or hill slope erosion. In terms of E. coli, it's an issue right across our freshwater bodies in Northland. Not so bad in lakes, but rivers particularly dire. Our monitored sites, about 94% of them are either in a poor or very poor state. We've got a national direction to improve the swimmability of our waterways right across New Zealand. We're particularly challenging in Northland. The sources, again, fecal matter from animals is the most dominant source. So ruminants, that's your cattle, sheep, deer, but also human wastewater is a source, whether it's domestic treatment plants, and waterfowl is prominent here and there, a bit more localized. So we know where it's coming from, and there are some relatively straightforward fixes in terms of conceptually they're straightforward, but they come at cost. The other key one, that this macroinvertebrates attribute is an indicator of ecosystem health in water bodies. It's basically a measure of bug life, and the bug life are incredibly important for our aquatic species like fish and eels and the like. So it's a really good indicator of how healthy our waterways are, our rivers. The data we've got, our monitored sites, those red dots on that map there, are showing that they're in a poor state. They're below a national bottom line. We must improve. The government's direction on us, we must set targets to improve the state of ecological health of these waterways. However, it's not a simple attribute to manage. There's multiple influences on macroinvertebrates and ecosystem health generally. Shade and temperature are pretty critical. Water quality, i.e. sediment, and nutrients and things like that can really influence it as well. Flows in rivers and lake, is a critical one as well. And so sort of flushing flows are really important for habitat health. That one, multiple factors at play, going to make it quite tricky to actually improve. But we've got some tools. However, the scale of these challenges is region-wide, and the solutions are almost landscape scale in many cases. So we apply really broadly to get the remedies we're after across the region. The problem is we've got a fairly limited toolbox. The key rules, there ain't a huge number of them, and they're things like controls on land disturbance, so limiting the scale of earthworks and the proximity to waterways to manage sediment, controlling the amount of vegetation cleared, especially on riparian margins on our highly erodible land, rules around excluding stock from water. That's a critical one for improving the state in terms of E. coli. And it's also a remedy for sediment. And you can imagine stock in waterways also trample riverbeds, so impact the habitat, stir up sediment. So that's a fairly key one. Riparian setbacks for things like land disturbance as well, or application of fertilizer, application of farm dairy effluent and the like, and controls on discharges to land and water, things like farm dairy effluent and wastewater from treatment plants and the like. So we do have some tools. The regulatory ones are pretty key. We've also got some actions we can undertake, and we'll get into a bit more detail on that, but that's the things we can do to support landowners to achieve the outcomes we're after. So that's kind of me. And on to our next presenter.
Kia ora, Justin. Thank you very much for that. So very quick recap. We really need to do something about freshwater quality. The signals from central government and our community is that change is needed. What we need is feedback from our communities at this point through the draft freshwater plan change process. And so I would encourage everyone online, if you've got any questions ticking over in your head, put them in the Q&A session, and our panelists will get to those towards the end of the session. So the next speaker is Meta Norris, and I'm going to follow her instructions and provide her a very brief intro. Meta is from Te Parawhau. She's lived here her entire life, and she's not going anywhere. So kia ora, Meta. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the introduction, Ruben. What I want to see is some key opportunities for tangata whenua to get involved in the freshwater planning reforms that are coming. We need you to provide feedback to the Northland Regional Council on their draft freshwater plan change and action plan. This is important for tangata whenua because for our whānau, it increases our opportunity to be involved in actively improving our freshwater with actions to support riparian planting and wetland restoration, but also rules that might mean you need to get consents or fence off waterways and steep hill country. It also might affect whether there is any water available in the future. At hapu level, the draft freshwater plan and actions might mean increasing requests for cultural impact assessments, but also increasing opportunities to be actively involved in freshwater management and decision-making. There are also actions proposed to do more detailed freshwater planning to define November Wai in future. For our hapu, this might mean they have to look at their commercial operations especially farming and plantation forestry assets, and see what the proposed rules might mean for their operations. It also might mean there is support for water being allocated for development of Māori land and settled assets. Where three waters get reformed and repealed is another question. But what we do know is that councils have to go ahead and notify their freshwater plan changes next year. And they're putting out a draft now for feedback. So now is the time to influence what's going into that plan change next year. Next slide. So let me share some of my personal thoughts, that's dangerous, on what the key challenges are. We have a legacy of colonisation and bad management decisions that have left our wai in a bad way. So not only do we have to change where, what and how we're farming, we also need to change how we make decisions about freshwater as well. And it's not small changes that we need. As the ever-increasing effects of climate change are felt, with increasing severe droughts, storm and floods, increasing temperatures, sea levels, and more wildfires, the ability for our awa e ripua to adapt to these changes is going to be critical. We know that the healthier the ecosystem, the more resilient it will be to climate change. So it's not good news that our freshwater is in dire state. We don't have long to fix the situation so that our waterways and communities are healthy and best positioned to deal with the increasing impacts of global warming. Tāngata whenua need to be empowered and enabled so that we can properly fulfill our kaitiaki roles and obligations, and also ensure that we can access the safe and clean water we need, given the only increasing pressures we know climate change is bringing. Colonisation separation from our whenua and disempowerment of our kaitiaki has meant that the Western way of looking at the world has lost sight of the knowledge and wisdom that we hold as mana whenua, and the significant contribution we make as proactive kaitiaki. We all need to understand what is at stake, and we need to work together if we are truly prepared to have a sustainable future. Tātou mā, now is the time to get involved in planning and legislative reform and equip ourselves with the skills and resources needed to participate. Whether that is on our own marae or whānau planning for the future, all of our communities need to know what these changes mean for us. And that is going to take time, resources, and capacity access to in Taitukarau, across Taitukarau. The Whenau for all of us is here. How can we better utilise our combined mātauranga pukenga and to ensure our people are entitled and supported to have their say on our taiao and why need us? Slide 3. This is a huge challenge. How do we turn around our fresh water as being treated and valued? How can we weave together two differing worldviews, one based on whakapapa and ngā atua that treasures wai as a taonga and a living being, and the other based on man being dominion over nature and seeing water as a resource. to be profited from. Ko wai mātou. The Tāngata Whenua Water Advisory Group, or TWAG, are a rōpū of kaitiaki and technicians from differing professional backgrounds who all whakapapa to Tai Tukurau. Tai Tukurau TWAG was set up by Northland Regional Council at the end of 2020 to provide advice to Council on what this new freshwater planning regime might look like from Tāngata Whenua perspective. We were also asked to give Council advice on how they could engage with Tāngata Whenua on this freshwater plan change. This online hui is one of our recommendations for a series of hui throughout the Council's freshwater plan process, along with various other recommendations. I must acknowledge all the members of the group, past and present, and in particular Tui Shortland, who was the co-author of the first report produced by the group last year. She led TWAG through a series of wānanga, looking at all issues and values identified in the various hapu and iwi management plans that Council has and some other founding advice TWAG have built on. We've developed that founding work into recommendations as to what might go into the freshwater plan change from Tāngata Whenua perspective as a platform so that whānau marae and hapu can add their own perspectives and voices as Council develops its plan change over the next few years. Slide 4. This has taken a huge amount of work since January 2021, with more than 60 TWAG workshop meetings, countless Zoom calls and email exchanges. Once we presented our recommendations to TMAC, and these were endorsed to Council, TWAG representatives also participated in 13 workshops with councillors to go through various aspects of the freshwater plan change. We've also been involved in numerous meetings with Council staff to help refine the provisions in response to feedback from councillors. The ability for us to work closely with staff to refine and respond to questions has been invaluable, but has required huge time commitment from a handful of us. This has sometimes been challenging space to be in, particularly trying to weave together te ao Māori ways of viewing the world and one where economic imperatives are predominant. It has entailed a huge amount of sustained effort from TWAG members, and we hope that what we have come up with provides a good basis for others to add their korero to. TWAG was fortunate to have the help from Puwaikake, Amy Machu, and Rebecca Reid, and others in drafting our recommendations. And you can find our reports on Council's Why It Matters webpage. Slide 5. TWAG and TMAC see the advice given to Council as providing a platform or trading or holding place for everyone to add to as Council develops its freshwater plan change in the next couple of years. We have been clear to Council that our advice is they need to support everyone so they can engage in this freshwater plan change, mahi, if we wish to, and our advice does not constitute consultation or engagement with Tāngata Whenua. We don't have a mandate to speak on behalf of everyone. We are providing our advice as individuals with expertise in this space. It's impossible to provide advice at the level of detail that can only come from local communities, whānau, hapu, marae, and kaitiaki on the ground. So our advice, we hope, will provide a framework for others to add to reflect the different values and perspectives that exist across Taitukurau. We think there are many values and issues of concern about the state of our fresh water that are common across Taitukurau, but central to all our thinking is Te Hurihunga Wai. I've included what we proposed for a statement as to what Te Manawa Te Wai means in Taitukurau as a starting point. For others to comment on, we have some policies and objectives, attributes, and targets that we hope others will think about and add to in their feedback to NRC on the draft plan change. We've proposed values and visions which will allow marae hapu whānau to add their region-wide provisions and to recognise everyone's tikanga and mātauranga. The weaving together tai ao Māori and Western world views to improve the Māori of our wai is a challenge. For example, roles and duties associated with rangatiratanga and kaitiakitanga can only be carried out by whānau, marae, hapu, as they have a responsibility through whakapapa to care for and protect our waters. It is hard for council to fully understand some of the concepts that are fundamental to how tangata whenua look after water. Whatever words end up in council's freshwater plans, when it's notified and goes through the freshwater hearing process, it is critical that we work to make sure that implementation also involves us as tangata whenua, far beyond water monitoring, where we exercise our rangatira in decision-making on consents needed under the new freshwater plan. It's going to take time and resources. The Freshwater Action Plan includes several actions that have been proposed by TWAG, and in particular, the need for council to work at community level with us to define appropriate hapuri wai for our dohi awa, and visions, values, and objectives at a local level that can build on the regional level approach taken so far. Council has included these as a proposal action in their draft action plan. They're also included our recommendations to progress enabling greater involvement of tangata whenua in freshwater management. Slide 6. A huge amount of work has gone into the draft freshwater plan change, which is a large document itself and not an easy read. For TWAG, there are a few key aspects that we want to highlight that we see as being fundamental. Council engaging with tangata whenua and communities to define what their vision and values are for their wai. That is going to take resourcing and time and needs to be funded through the LTP, long-term plan. But there is no guarantee resourcing is going to come to do that work. Our recommendation for all water to be given legal personhood. By that, we mean all water be treated with respect as a living entity with its own rights to be healthy and thrive. There is already precedent in Aotearoa that you'll be familiar with legal personhood status being conferred through statute for the Whenau River. Whilst we understand that NRC cannot give legal personhood status through treaty settlement, there are examples from around the world where local governments, Indigenous peoples, and communities have provided legal protection for rivers. Council has agreed to do further work to look at what this might look like in practice and what options are available for appointing guardians to speak on behalf of the Wai. This is a key aspect in realigning a Western world view that has treated rivers as water infrastructure resources to be utilised to a more balanced approach, acknowledging our Te Ao Māori worldview, where rivers are living entities and intertwined with our whenua and communities through whakapapa. Slide 7. Another key policy that we recommend that Council didn't put into the draft plan change was one which reserves an allocation of water for targeted use. They have, however, put out a separate consultation document. The policy implements some of the key values and targets we have also proposed, and basically sets aside 20% of any water that is being allocated for 4 specific purposes: for environmental enhancement and restoration of wetlands and the creation of new wetlands, for domestic use by papakainga marae and the use on Maori land, and the final is a catch-all. So any other use, as long as it contributes to a fund. There are no suggestions as to how much exactly what that fund would be used for, or any details, but what we do know that in order to fix up our waterways at the speed we need to, is going to cost. The question is, where is that money going to come from? As a mechanism by which those who are applying for a consent to take water for any of those other purposes, then they could contribute to a fund that can be used to help cover the cost of the work we know needs to be done. That fund could be used to pay for wetland restoration, riparian planting, native forest restoration on highly erodible land that landowners are otherwise not going to be able to afford to do. One of the other reasons we propose this targeted water allocation policy will go some way towards recognising the need to restore the Māori of our Wai across Tāngata, and by allowing more water for the rivers and wetlands is critical. We really encourage feedback on our proposal and hope Council will include the policy in a notified version of the plan change next year. We've also recommended policies which Council has in the draft plan, most with some amendments which affect the roles and responsibilities tangata whenua have as kaitiaki and rangatira, and reflects our whakapapa and relationships with our Wai, weaving together both Western science and Te Ao Māori provides a strengthened approach to freshwater management that is urgently needed. The final aspect I'd like to highlight, which is where recommended increasing the activities which require cultural impact assessments to be done as part of the consent application process. There are numerous instances we're aware of where projects and proposals could have benefited from local knowledge and understanding. Undertaking CIAs is one way in which Tāngata Whenua can be involved in freshwater management. So we welcome feedback on whether requiring CIAs for the activity that Council has included in the draft plan change might be effective, and whether there are other activities that should also require CIAs. Oh, slide 8. You have an opportunity to influence what goes into the new freshwater plan rules for Tāngata right now. It's our opportunity to have a say in what the freshwater future will look like, and to make changes we all need so we have access to clean and healthy fresh water. Have you ever complained about a resource consent process and had enough of our waterways being mistreated? Then this is an excellent opportunity to make a difference. We've got some excellent projects and initiatives happening, and this freshwater plan change can also look at what support and resources Council provide to support kaitiaki and communities on the ground, whether that's to do monitoring or restoration and enhancement. We need to think about the support needed to make that happen, and that's why the draft action plan is so critical. This is a step on a long journey, as we all know, so I'd encourage everyone to get involved in the new freshwater plan change. We all need to get our heads around the reforms that are coming. This is our opportunity to influence what we want to see happening in Tāngata. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Mira. Thank you very much for your kōrero, and I just want to acknowledge the mahi that yourself and the Tāngata Whenua Water Advisory Group has contributed towards the freshwater plan change process, and also emphasise the importance of providing feedback at this stage. We've got plenty of questions coming in. Keep them coming. We will try our darndest to answer them all. Those that we don't answer, we will be putting up on our website our responses. And just a quick reminder, this webinar will be recorded and made available as well for those of you who need to review some of the discussions we've held tonight. Now, our next speaker is Leon Kiefer. He is our policy specialist, and he'll be getting into a bit of detail around how these rules, draft rules, could come into place. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ruben. Thank you to Mira, Justin, and Jack before me. You really covered the guts of everything, the background, why we're doing it. There are a lot of questions that we want to answer, so I'm going to try to compress my presentation down and get to the nitty-gritty. So I'm here to tell you about some of the draft rules that we've come up with and how they might affect you, because that's really what you're here to find out. So we have come up with new draft rules and policies. Really important to note that they are draft, still open to feedback. It's a moving beast, and we really want to get this right. So the more feedback you give us, the better outcome for Northland that we'll have. The new rules bring about new resource consent requirements, encouraging certain land uses, discouraging other ones. It does have financial implications on the landowners, on the ratepayer base as a whole. Council is looking at ways of supporting this, and we will get through that, I think, in some detail during the questions. So very high level, what are the draft rule changes being considered? The 5 on screen is a summary document that came along with some of the media info that went out. These are really the key ones that I think a lot of us are focused on. So protecting highly erodible land, stock out of waterways and wetlands, controls on exotic forests, elimination and reduction of wastewater discharges to water, and the impacts on Tāngata whenua values that Mira went through in the previous presentation. So I really want to hone in on a few of these that haven't really been covered in too much detail. And we'll start off with the rules that we're considering around highly erodible land protection and riparian setbacks. So as Justin pointed out, we don't have any defined rules that have been agreed as of yet. We're really seeking your feedback on what possible ways can we mitigate the generation and discharge of sediment and E. coli to our waterways. The current rules that we have in place in the regional plan and in the national environmental standards, they're not effective enough to make the amount of change that we need to in the amount of time that we have. So the national direction is to make significant change in a set period of time. So we're looking at over the next 10, 20, 30 years, not, you know, we'll figure it out in the next generation. So some of the things that we're considering and asking for feedback on, what livestock do we want to exclude? You know, at the moment, it's very much set in beef cattle, dairy cattle, sheep, deer, sometimes goats, sometimes. So we want to understand what does the Northland livestock definition look like? Options for riparian setbacks. The national environmental standards require a 3-meter setback. We're looking at 3, 5, and 10 meters in this discussion document. We know that the further away the fence is from the stream, the more ecological benefits we get. Depending on what's in that riparian setback, we'll get better filtering, but that's loss of more productive land. It's more costs for the fencing. So we really need to understand what's realistic, what's achievable. Topography makes things even more difficult. So if you're in an area with highly erodible land, so as we've looked to define it, is based on slope. So over 35 degrees, that's really, really steep. It's what we consider to be at severe risk of erosion. 35 degrees is very difficult to, you can't walk up it. You're you know, scrambling up it. 25 to 35 degrees, if you're fit enough, you can walk up it, but it's not fun. It's definitely not fun herding sheep up and down it, I can tell you. But a lot of our land in Northland is, you know, within that 25 to 35 degree area. A lot of it is currently in pasture. Over 35 degree, most of it is woody vegetation. You're looking at steep gully banks or, you know, mountain ranges, that sort of thing. But we do have some that is being grazed. So we're looking at what are the methods that we could put into place to either minimize the risk from grazing that land. That might be through excluding them permanently. There might be times of the year when we think it's appropriate. Maybe different types of livestock could go on. So these are things that we want to hear from you. We want to know what works for you and what doesn't work. We, as Jack mentioned very early on, we can't come up with rules that we can't enforce. But at the same time, we have a serious issue and we do need to do something to address it. Riparian setbacks is another tool that we're looking at. So as I mentioned, the further the setback, excuse me, the better the environmental benefits. So in the Have Your Say discussion document, we do have this comparative table. We do have 30 meters in here, and that's just for reference. That's not something that's being considered. In the far right-hand column is very important. These are estimates of the cost to implement this. So that's including your fencing cost, your planting cost, your loss of productive land. ongoing pest management, etc. So as you can see, the further away from a stream you go, the more expensive it becomes for the landowner. These are based off of averages. So we haven't picked any particular farm. We haven't been able to get down into that minutia. Everything is based on averages and models. So it's not a one size fits all assessment, but we had to start from somewhere. So we're putting this out there to the community. And I'm sure you'll be happy to give us some feedback on this type of question. So here's just an example of our highly erodible land maps. So this is out on the East Coast, this property here. And as you can see, that southern paddock, it's about 5 hectares, probably about 40% has that HEL1, HEL1 land, which is at 25 degrees. That's all currently being grazed. A lot of the highly erodible land 2 which is that red layer, that's already in woody vegetation. So if you look up your property on this is something like what you'll see. Now, this is based off of LiDAR. So that's, light laser beam shot from an airplane, and it really measures down, to the millimeter almost. So this is really, really fine grained. And, some of these pixels are probably the size of a man, right? So are we going to ask you to fence off this little pixel? Probably not. So we really need to understand what's realistic. So what we've given you is the raw data. This isn't a rule. It's not set in stone. This is the data. This is just showing you we've got highly erodible land. We've got steep slopes in Northland. What can we do about it? So just a bit of context for you. We also have some tweaks to the rules around land preparation and cultivation. So earthworks, vegetation clearance, etc. It all falls under the same category. When you dig up land, there's a risk of sediment being transported downhill, and it'll eventually end up in the streams. So we are looking at requiring resource consents for land preparation, cultivation, if you're on one of those highly erodible land layers. And if you're within a certain distance from a water body, I've got them up on the screen. I won't get into too much detail to save on time. It's worth noting that the resource consent pathway here, we're looking at changing it to discretionary, which means that council have more ability to determine if certain cultivations on highly erodible land can be declined. I don't foresee this to be a huge issue across Northland, but it's just giving council the assurance that we can meet these big targets that the government has set for us. The earthworks permitted activity thresholds have also been updated slightly to really to incorporate our proposed definitions for the highly erodible land. We're also adding some more clarifications around earthworks within Dune Lake and outstanding ecological value catchments. Note that these are the permitted activity thresholds. Again, if you can't comply with this, you go on to a resource consent application. Erosion sediment controls are often pretty straightforward, depending on the type of cultivation or earthworks that you're undertaking. So vegetation clearance, the riparian vegetation, so the vegetation along the stream banks, we're looking at applying these after the 1st of Jan 2027 for plantation forests, and we're looking at requiring resource consents for clearance over 200 square meters or 20 meters length in riparian margins. We're also identifying that there's an issue with disturbance around inanga spawning sites and sites of significance to Tāngata Whenua. These are not mapped. So this is where consultation with Tāngata Whenua is important when applying for a resource consent application. They're able to help identify inanga spawning sites or sites of significance to Tāngata Whenua. And we also are looking at highly erodible land rules that are specific to those 25-degree slopes and over. So while we're looking at encouraging, potentially more of that steep hill country to be forested, we still want to make sure that when those trees get harvested, we don't have mass movements of sediment coming down the hills. So looking to tweak the rules to make sure that we're not just doing clear fell. So it's a permitted activity to harvest if you're not doing clear fell. If you leave 75% of that highly erodible land within woody vegetation, otherwise we've got set limits. Otherwise, again, resource consent pathway. Same thing with new forests. We're looking at controlling where new forests go. We know that pine plantations use a lot of water. They change the way that groundwater hydrology and stream hydrology work within catchments. So where we do have significant high value dune lake catchments, or where we're within proximity to streams, we want to make sure that the planting and all the infrastructure that goes into maintaining forestry doesn't have those side effects of changing groundwater stream hydrology and creating sediment close to those waterways. Another key rule that I think we need to be aware of are the discharges to water rules. So we want to phase out discharges of wastewater to water. So domestic wastewater discharges to water, that's prohibited, whether it's treated or untreated. So if you have a septic tank treatment system with a hose that goes into a stream, that's prohibited. This goes for municipal, for town water treatment plants as well. So if there's a wastewater treatment plant that currently discharges to a river, that is prohibited for new ones. There are some existing ones that do that. It's a much harder test to renew that resource consent. It will be a non-complying activity for those wastewater treatment plants. I do know that in Northland, there is a general look at discharging municipal wastewater to ground. It requires a lot more land, it's more expensive, but that is something that wastewater treatment plant operators are looking at. Farm wastewater discharges are probably more pertinent to the rural community. So currently, if you discharge farm wastewater dairy effluent to land, it's a permitted activity. We're looking at making it a controlled activity, meaning that you would require a resource consent. It would be granted provided you show that all of those controls are met. And the reason that we're doing that really is just to make sure that we don't have any downstream sensitive receivers and that everything's really captured through that process. New discharges to land, we're looking at making a discretionary activity. And that's important because if we have existing farm dairy effluent discharges to water, for instance, we're looking at making that a non-complying activity if you're renewing an existing one, but you'll have an expiry date January 2030. Following that and any new discharges to water, it would be prohibited. So really encouraging discharge to land systems. And if you have an existing dairy discharge into a stream and you do have a resource consent, just know that by 2030, we're really looking to make that change to a discharge to land. So that would be a new resource consent process to go through. There haven't been many changes to the horticulture production land discharges, minor tweaks, but no real fundamental change in how that works. Miro went through the targeted water allocation process. I won't delve into this too much, so we'll leave some time. So big take home message. I know we say words like exclusion. It's not a prohibition. So really what we're doing is recognizing the significant changes that we need to make to improve our waterways, recognizing that it's going to be very, very difficult, and we can't continue on the way that we're going. So we're putting in these rules where we think we're relatively confident that if we implement rules like these, then we'll be able to achieve those environmental benefits through resource consents or through the freshwater farm planning process, which we'll get to in the questions as well. Unfortunately, the timing of the freshwater farm plans and the freshwater plan change they didn't quite mesh as well as we would have liked. So we have to deal with these somewhat separately, but they will eventually coincide. It's just a really awkward time, but we're on a very tight deadline to get these changes through. So that's why this process is continuing on, regardless of everything else that could be happening in New Zealand regulation and politics. And the other key point that Mira pointed out, that new applications for resource consent on freshwater issues may require cultural impact assessments. Early engagement is really key. So even now, nothing to do with the freshwater plan change. If you engage with Tāngata whenua early, you're likely to get a much better outcome. Everyone is happier the earlier you engage. The draft action plan, again, these are the actions that Northland Regional Council are doing on the left-hand side, current actions, things that we need to do on the right-hand side. All of this is time, resource, money. So we really need to think how to achieve everything and how to help the ratepayers achieve everything. So we're all in the same boat. We just have different tools and different levers that we really are pulling. So this is something that is still very much open-ended. We haven't landed on a lot of this stuff. It really depends on how the feedback comes through on the draft plan. So this is definitely a work in progress. And as for a timeline, just reiterating, 4th of March is the deadline for having your say on the draft plan change. And then we're going to be working really hard to develop a proposed plan change, taking on all the feedback that you've given, and then notified a proposed plan. The goal is late 2024. That's the deadline that we've been given. And that's a really key time. Rules that are in that notified plan will have immediate legal effect. So if there's something in the current draft plan that you're unhappy with, tell us now, and we'll do our very best to tweak it, because once the proposed plan comes out, you can still submit, but it will have immediate legal effect. So there will be some ramifications there. All right, and that's my truncated presentation. Ruben, over to you.
Kia ora, Leon. Thank you for that. So we've heard the reason why we're doing this. We've been provided a really brief overview of Tāngata whenua input and some details around the implications of these draft provisions for landowners. So what we're going to do now is open the questions that were received up to the panel. And just a reminder, our panelists are our 3 elected members and our presenters. So I'm going to pass the first question over to Councillor John Blackwell. And this is a question that has been asked around whether or not we are serious around receiving input and the value of receiving input at this point in time. And the question also puts forward a bit of technical information there around the things that we consider, and I'll hand that response over to Leon. But in the meantime, Councillor Blackwell, interested in your response around the value of providing input at this stage.
Yes, thank you, Ruben. That's a really important part of this process, is that we hear what people say. There are some people that are a bit cynical about submitting on these type of things, but I assure you I will make it my utmost to read every submission and feed into what these plans will be in the future. And when you submit, you've got to put in the reasons why you don't like a certain item, but it's even better if you can put a remedy to the problem that you've identified. Thank you, Ruben.
Good, Councillor Blackwell. So, Leon, the next part of the question is around giving consideration to other means of managing the impacts of runoff into streams. So rather than considering setbacks, we consider other controls. So would you like to go into how that can be approached through this draft plan change process?
Sure. So the way that we are approaching this is by setting rules. We're basically setting a baseline, which says what you can do without us knowing about it, or without us, providing any regulatory action. But if you don't meet those permitted baselines, you do need to apply for a resource consent. So when we talk about riparian setbacks, let's say we land on 5 meters. A permitted activity might be that you fence off 5 meters from the stream and stock are excluded from that area. If someone has a herd of Arapawa sheep or goats that they use to control blackberry or gorse, something like that, and they're able to put up some temporary fencing within that 5 meter riparian setback, that can be approved perhaps through a resource consent process. But the key thing is that that resource consent wouldn't allow 80 dairy cows to blitz through there during the wet season. It wouldn't allow unmanaged access by stock in there at any time. So having a riparian setback doesn't necessarily mean that that land is unusable or unproductive. It just means that for your typical permitted farm grazing operations, it needs to be set back 5 meters. That's in a theoretical world where we land on 5 meters. We haven't landed on any setback yet. But it is worth noting that the national environmental standards for setbacks are at 3 meters, and it does enable farmers to cross streams or have access to streams, provided it's no more than 2 times in a year. So there is sort of already a framework like that in place. So at the moment, those setback rules do apply, and we are not allowed to have stock in streams. We do need to have a 3 meter setback. So if you apply for a resource consent and you can prove that the effects are going to be managed, then there's really nothing we can do to say, no, you can't do it. So it's a good tool. I think if you come up with a good idea, then you can use it to your advantage.
Thank you, Leon. Stay on the line because the next question is for you as well. So we've received a question around the role of the new freshwater farm plan requirements, in addition to other non-regulatory mechanisms through which this package gets brought into fruition.
So the freshwater farm plan process is still quite new. Definitely new in Northland. I believe it's been in use in the Waikato and another region. But we still really haven't seen how effective it could be up in Northland. What it means is, from my point of view, if you have an accredited or an approved freshwater farm plan, and in that plan you show all the ways that you can manage your farm in order to avoid or mitigate some of these effects, sedimentation, discharges, etc., that's basically a resource consent application. So if you have an accredited freshwater farm plan, you provide it to council, you've done 90% of the work. There might be a few other things which aren't covered by those regulations. So for example, consultation with Tāngata Whenau, then the resource consent process would add those things in. It wouldn't necessarily be a duplication of effort. That's Northland Regional Council doesn't have the resources to duplicate their efforts either. So we're really all working together to be as practical in the implementation as possible. Other regulatory or other non-regulatory methods, there's always, if there's demand for it, regional council can look to, advocacy programs, or, in the past, we've got the poplar nursery and encouraged that sort of land management practice. Lots of other ways to do it. And really, the regional council is whatever you want it to be. You just need to tell your councillors what you want, and if we can do it, we'll have a crack. Yeah.
Thank you, Leon. Appreciate that response. I'm going to cut to Jack now, because that's actually quite a good segue to the next, well, to a question that we have received around whether or not council will consider rates relief on top of consent subsidies. And so this directly ties into Leon's discussion around non-regulatory support. So over to you, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Ruben. Yeah, I'd like to assure you that council has discussed this in quite some detail, actually. Two questions. First of all, would council consider reduced or subsidies towards the resource consent costs? Yes, we have discussed that. In fact, we've discussed everything from having nil consent costs up to your normal expected costs, and so we're giving that some thought now about how that could be achieved, because a lot of those consents will be quite standard. You know, they'll be the same for one farmer and the next and the next. There'll be refinements, but remember that some of those conditions will be covered by farm plans anyway. So yes, so that's the answer to the first part. Now the second part is very important to me. Either reducing rates on land, and it's something I've raised many times, because some territorial councils in New Zealand levy nil rates on land that's taken out of production, i.e. QE2 covenants. In our view, land that is retired from grazing, either by being behind a fence that fences off a waterway, or highly erodible hill country, is no longer available for production. So why should it be subject to rates, especially since that land is now adding to ecological condition, it's adding to air quality, because it's sequestering carbon and releasing oxygen under photosynthesis, and it's improving water quality. So it's doing a lot of the things that we set out to do in our mission. So we're pretty keen to look at how we can remove that land from being rated at all. Now, I have to say that's not an easy task, because the territorial authorities levy rates on our behalf. We set our rates and they collect it. So there's quite a lot of jockeying around to make sure we get that physically able to be done. But yes, we're on the case. So I think that answers the question. Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for that. And so again, the take home is provide your feedback around that, so to enable elected members to consider this as an option as part of the action plan. So we're going to get into a couple more technical questions now. So this one's for Justin, our strategic policy specialist. So this question relates to whether or not we have any studies and how we've considered the effects of monocropping and plantation forestry on our water quality.
Yeah, no, good question. It's actually quite tricky to study the effects of pine plantation forestry on water, because of the length of the growing cycle, or the forestry cycle, 28 years or so. So we know over the growing period that the forest, as it grows, can reduce the sediment loss as it stabilizes land, and generally that's quite effective over that period, until we come to harvest and the earthworks associated with harvest, where we can get pulses of sediment. And especially if clearfell harvest over large areas exposes earth to severe rain and the like. So it can be quite tricky to study. We do have evidence of forestry activity impacting on water quality, particularly around sediment. But in terms of across a region, I'm not aware of anything, but there has been, I think, studies elsewhere. And there's also been studies on the impact of pine forest on hydrology. So if you plant forest around wetlands, for example, pines drink a lot of water. They can affect the hydrology of that wetland, and similar with dune lakes. We've had evidence in Northland of dune lakes level dropping as a result of pine forests intervening on the hydrological cycle. There's also been some evidence in dune lakes of tannins from pines as well. So we can look into that further if that would help.
Thanks, Justin. Nice response. So stay on the line. I've got another question for you. So this one relates to the maps that we showed in the lead up to your discussions around sediment and phosphorus. So this relates to the dates that we showed on the maps. So our maps have a date of 2015 to 2019, and the question is, are these maps up to date?
Yeah, that's a great question. So under the NPS, we're required to set a baseline state. So what's that? It's sort of a line in the sand about what's our starting point for tracking progress against freshwater improvement. We needed that for the development of the draft, which the NPS, sort of came out in 2020. So we needed something to work from. There's often a lag in data as well. So as you can imagine, we collect data right through the year. So for 2023, we're still collecting data. We're still got to go through a QA and collation process, and then the analysis and spit out the results. So there is a delay, and we needed some data to work from. But we do track these things annually. We do monthly sampling in our rivers, and we can update those the results of that so people can see what the changes are compared to our baseline state set in that data period. And the other thing is we need 5 years data, so 60 samples per site, to have confidence in the result and the sample size and the data set.
So I've got a follow-up question that's linked to this particular one. So this relates to the same maps, and the question is, and you've more or less answered this, but maybe you might want to go into it in a bit more detail. So the question is about the point that fertilizer application rates have dropped since 2020, and so how do we factor that in to the maps which relate to a date prior to that time?
Yeah, that's another good question. So yes, I do recognise that there's been controls on particularly nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer since 2020 or thereabouts. So it has likely dropped. I guess in terms of the effect, we're not seeing widespread effects from the likes of fertilizer use in Northland. We do have localised nuisance algal growth that's related to nutrients and water temperature and the like, and low flows, particularly warmer parts of the year. But in terms of nitrogen in our rivers, it's more of a concern in lakes in Northland, which don't flush. But yes, you're right. There has been a bit of a shift in the way fertilizer has been used. The annual sampling we do can pick up the nutrient states and the likes of the rate, or the frequency and the locations we see nuisance algal growth, which is responding to nutrients in water. So we can track changes in our nutrient state for freshwater in rivers, yes, and lakes, actually.
Great, nice one, Justin. So I'm going to put the next question to Leon, but before I do, I see we've still got a good number of people online, and we've still got a few questions to go through. So we were scheduled to close off at 8 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend things to 8:15, and hopefully we can get through most of the questions by then. But if we don't, we will respond to them through our website. So next question, Leon. This is a great question. This relates to the kōrero around wastewater treatment plants. And the question is about how we've referred to E. coli, but whether or not there's issues and methodologies around the elimination of persistent chemicals within wastewater treatment plants, and whether that's something that we intend to manage through the draft freshwater plan change process.
Right. So yeah, the wastewater treatment plants really focus in on those I suppose the organic bugs that can be killed through UV treatment, etc. I believe I read the question, and I think we're referring to the PFAS. So these are persistent industrial chemicals that synthetic, human-made, used for firefighting in New Zealand for 50-some years. From what I understand, they're now banned. However, they're still in our environment, obviously, from being used for firefighting reasons. I don't know how prevalent they are in our wastewater treatment plants. However, I will note that we do have existing rules in our plan that deal with industrial discharges. So all industrial discharges need a resource consent. If it's determined that there are PFAS chemicals within a discharge, that would be a significant effect, a significant health effect that would need to be managed. I know that MFE and MPI are working along with Defence Force and other government agencies on kind of a national plan of attack on how to deal with this. We haven't really dealt with it specifically in this freshwater plan change, but I do accept that it is a significant health issue that New Zealand is dealing with. Fingers crossed, I don't know, but I'm hoping that it isn't much of an issue in Northland. I've definitely seen it elsewhere in the country, but yeah.
Thanks, Leon. I'm going to ask you another question, and then there's the first part of this question is linked to freshwater farm plans and other things, and then the other component of it I'm going to hand over to Mera to provide some input on, because it relates to the role of sort of kaitiakitanga accreditation and certification and a community-led approach. And so I'm interested in Mera, your view around that as a management tool for us. So the first part of the question is around the fact that we need to, in addition to considering blanket initiatives, have community-wide sort of action around ensuring awareness and education and that sort of thing. And I just want you to touch on, Leon, around the role of action plans and the freshwater farm plan process around enabling that.
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, advocacy and education, Regional Council currently has a land management team, biodiversity team. They go out and they, help landowners and farmers and communities understand what's in their backyard, what's in their environment. Also help determine what are the best ways of managing certain things on their land around those significant values. So when it comes to developing freshwater farm plans, these are sort of areas within your property that will get picked up. So if it's being prepared by yourselves, or if you've got an accredited person preparing it for you on behalf, at the end of the day, you'll be working with existing teams at Regional Council with accredited freshwater farm plan professionals, with Tāngata whenua, with your neighbors, and you'll be identifying areas of value within your own property, systems that you use on your farm, and it's sort of just telling an overarching story of how you manage your land use to coexist really with that surrounding environment. So Northland Regional Council needs to provide more resources on that education and advocacy side. So we will be expanding, or we'll be looking to expand our existing programs around land management, engagement, that side of things. And we will most likely be looking at increasing consenting and farm management personnel as well. But that's for future council to decide, I guess, down the road a ways.
Thanks, Leon. Nice one. Kia ora Mera. So the next component, yep, the next component of this question is around the role of kaitiakitanga in respect of the long-term management of our waterways. And I wondered if you could just briefly touch on sort of the feedback that TWAG has provided in respect of the role of Tāngata whenua over in terms of freshwater management.
Most of the work that we have done on TWAG has been life experiences of most of the members of TWAG, and how they have looked after their immediate properties. So we build on each other's knowledge for kaitiakitanga. So kaitiakitanga is to use your best historical practices today as we did back then on protecting the waterways and the environment. But you have to protect the environment first, so that none of the waste from around the environment goes into your waterways to begin with, because it's very hard to deal with anything once it gets into it. So kaitiakitanga is for us as practitioners to maintain the standards that we've always had, and different areas have different practices. So we're all different, but it's all about the practices that we've all been taught and making sure that we continue to look after the environment around us. Does that help?
Yeah, great. That's really valuable. So next question, I'm going to hand over to Justin again. This is a great question. Right, so we've provided these maps for our erosion prone land and our land that's prone at high risk to erosion. So what happens if a landowner disagrees with what those maps show in terms of the slopes and that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. So this draft process is the perfect opportunity to do that, to give us indications of where perhaps things got things wrong, or the problems that are associated with, say, stock exclusion rules that relate to these areas. So we'd be very keen to hear about that. This draft process is the perfect time, and yes, we can make changes if the mapping looks wrong. We can also recognise some of because the mapping is so high resolution and very pixelated, the rules that may apply, assuming they get developed on the basis of these maps, can recognise that and say, look, provide some flexibility for landowners to, say, fence 80% of their property, or whatever it is, X% of their property that is mapped here. So the landowner can make the choice about which bits the least productive and would probably be the most benefit to fencing. And if you've got a little humpy hillock in the middle of a paddock that's nowhere near water, then maybe leave that one out. The other thing we can do, for example, is take out the very small areas, so anything under X 100 square meters, whatever. So it sort of looks a little less problematic for the landowner to deal with. So there's a range of options here. But yes, we want to hear from people if we think we've got the maps wrong or the approach is wrong, either way.
Good, Justin. Thanks for that. So I'm going to put this question to Councillor Marty Robinson. It's a really good question around the implications of the proposed rules on the economy, and what sort of thinking council has put forward in terms of how best to compensate for that, bearing in mind the implications of the draft provisions on people's production land.
Yeah, thanks, Ruben. I'm on screen here. Thanks for that question. It's often been said that this is taking land out of production, it's a loss of income. There's two ways that could be looked at. One is, yes, for instance, the fencing off the riparian strip is taking land out of stock production, but there are alternative means of production in productive riparian buffers, whether you put planting manuka for honey, or kanuka for even higher value honey as opposed to Australian manuka honey, or medicinal purposes, rongo Maori, even planting willows for coppicing and using the willow for feeding to the stock further into the paddocks. So there is that one for starters. The other off-farm income that was pointed out to us yesterday in the workshop, that Northland, for every one person on land, there's 1.5 people off the farming area who are adding value to that product. In the Waikato, there are 7 people adding value to that product. In Auckland, there are 30 people who are employed adding value to the product. So there's the potential to have a higher value, for instance, with forestry. Obviously, there's implications of competition, etc. But for adding value, whether it be by, I know down the road, Mahui cheese, who adding value to their milk by having a finished product that is highly saleable and highly sought after, and also the timber plant that they have there, the Northland kauri. So those are, we don't necessarily mean to say it's the land lost or land taken off us or land out of production. There's room for use of that area.
Thank you, Marty. Yeah, so again, the take home is provide some feedback to us around your thinking in respect of the implications of these draft provisions on your production value. But so just a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to go to 2 more questions, and then I'll hand over to Councillor Jack Craw to provide a closing statement, and then we'll close off with a karakia, and we'll aim to be finished up at 8:15. Right, so this is a really good question, which again, Justin, it's coming your way. Right, so if waterway is already fenced, what are the expectations around shifting to the new setbacks?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of things that council will need to grapple with, recognising that the landowner's done the right thing, excluded stock from the waterway. I think there are options and rules to say recognise an existing fence can remain for the life of that fence and only needs to meet the new setback requirements once replaced. That's not an unusual sort of concept, quite pragmatic, but at the end of the day, council will need to make a decision on how those rules apply, but that seems an entirely doable and pragmatic approach. It still gets us the water quality benefits.
Okay, cool. So just a follow-up question, and Leon, this is something that you mentioned, so you get to respond to it. So this relates to a question around the pixelated effect of the maps, and to what extent, shown on the maps, landowners expected to fence. So if people have got a really small area on their land that might only show up on the map as, you know, a couple of square meters, what are the expectations around that?
Yeah, you tell us, really. Like I said before, it's really the raw data. So it's just the LiDAR data, looking at the, you know, when the plane flew over probably a couple years ago. So if we're trying to make a practical change, you know, we might be looking at 500 square meters, you know, something like that. We might look at it and averaging across an entire property or across an entire hillside. It's not decided yet. There's more work, there's more discussion that we need to have. So we're, you know, we need to get the most bang for our buck. So we need to find a solution that works for the environment as well as everyone with some yellow and red on the property.
Great stuff. So again, take home is, let us know your thoughts, give us your ideas around how best this could work on your property, and that'll enable our elected members to make a decision that is aligned with where the community needs to head. So I'm going to hand over to Councillor Jack Craw to provide a closing to this hui, and then I'll close out with the karakia, and we can go back to doing our day-to-day things.
Thanks, Ruben. I guess I'm on, am I? Yeah, thank you. Look, I'd like to thank everybody for taking part tonight and joining. We've all been taking notes, and I assure you that all your questions will be answered. And I guess the only thing left for me to say is that we'd really like everybody to submit. It's important that you submit. The process is pretty easy, so please get on there, because really it'll be the community that will decide as much as council that will decide the direction that we travel. So thank you very much, everybody.
Kia ora, Jack. Righto, so I'm going to close with the karakia, and thank you once again, everyone, for participating, and look forward to all your feedback. Kia noi tātou. Unahia, unahia. Unahia kia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara tangata. Ko ia rā i rongo. whakiria ake ki runga, kia tina. Hui e, tae ki e. Ka kite.
Thank you. Bye.